The church bells of Brackendale were not meant to ring that night. Christmas Eve bells were traditionally saved for midnight, a moment of joy and reflection that brought the village together year after year. Yet on this particular evening, the bells rang early, sharp, sudden, and unsettling. Their sound cut through the falling snow like a warning rather than a celebration. Echoing across rooftops and narrow lanes. Miss Jane Marple heard the bells from the sitting-room window of Rosewood Cottage, where she was spending the holidays at the invitation of her old friend, Clara Hastings. She paused mid-stitch, her knitting needles resting silently in her lap. Bells, she knew, rarely rang without reason. And when traditions were broken, it was often a sign that something had gone terribly wrong. Brackendale was a small village, the kind that prided itself on order, routine, and long-held customs. Christmas here followed a predictable pattern: decorated shop windows, polite exchanges, and the annual gathering at St. Aldwyn's Church. Beneath this orderly surface, however, lay rivalries as old as the stone buildings themselves. Miss Marple had encountered many such villages, each convinced of its own innocence. Clara Hastings entered the room, her face pale. "The bells," she said softly. "They shouldn't be ringing yet." Her voice carried a tremor she could not hide. Miss Marple met her gaze calmly. "No," she agreed, "they shouldn't." Word traveled quickly. Within minutes, whispers spread through the village. A body had been found inside the church tower. Thomas Belridge, the church warden, a man known for his strict adherence to tradition and moral order. He had been discovered at the foot of the bell ropes, his expression frozen in shock. As though death had come unexpectedly, snow thickened as villagers gathered outside the church. Murmuring, prayers, and speculation equal measure. Miss Marple arrived quietly among them, observing faces rather than listening to words. Grief wore many disguises: shock, outrage, even impatience. She noted who stood too close to the doors, who lingered at the edge of the crowd, and who avoided looking at the tower altogether. Thomas Belridge had not been universally loved. He was a man of rigid principles, intolerant of deviation, and quick to judge. He had recently been involved in several disputes over church funds, village events, and certain inappropriate behaviors he believed threatened Brackendale's respectability. Miss Marple stored these details away. Knowing that moral rigidity often bred resentment, the vicar attempted to restore calm, insisting the authorities be notified immediately. But the snowstorm made travel difficult. Brackendale, for the time being, was cut off from the outside world. Miss Marple recognized the familiar pattern: isolation, tension, and a crime that would demand patience rather than haste. As villagers dispersed reluctantly, Miss Marple lingered near the church entrance. She noticed a faint scuff mark near the bell ropes and a broken ornament from the Christmas wreath lying on the stone floor. Small details, easily overlooked, yet they suggested movement, perhaps a struggle, perhaps an attempt to stage an accident. That night, the bells remained silent. The village, however, did not sleep. Curtains twitched, lights burned late, and conversations whispered behind closed doors. Miss Marple sat by the fire, reflecting on what she had seen. The bells had rung early not by chance, but by consequence. Someone in Brackendale had wanted Thomas Belridge silenced. And someone had used the very symbol of Christmas unity, the church bells, to deliver a deadly message. As snow continued to fall, Miss Marple knew that the crime was only the beginning. The bells had announced more than a death. They had signaled the unraveling of secrets long protected by tradition and fear. And before Christmas morning arrived, Miss Marple intended to discover exactly who had set them ringing. The church tower of St. Aldwyn stood dark and imposing against the snowy sky, its stone walls steeped in centuries of faith, tradition, and unspoken authority. By morning, the villagers of Brackendale approached it with hesitation, as though the tower itself had become complicit in the crime. Miss Marple arrived early, bundled against the cold, her expression serene but alert. She had learned long ago that places, like people, absorbed the emotions poured into them. Inside, the air was cold and faintly metallic, carrying the lingering echo of the bells. The narrow staircase leading to the tower bore the marks of hurried footsteps, some fresh, some older. Miss Marple climbed slowly, noting the uneven wear on the steps and the faint smear of wax near the handrail. Wax, she reflected, suggested candles carried in haste rather than ceremony. At the top, the bell chamber was austere and orderly, much like Thomas Belridge himself had been. The ropes hung neatly, though one showed signs of recent strain. Miss Marple examined it closely, observing frayed fibers where it had been gripped too tightly. Someone had pulled the bells with force and fear. The spot where Belridge had been found was still marked faintly on the stone floor. There were no signs of prolonged struggle, no overturned furniture or scattered belongings. To Miss Marple, this suggested confrontation rather than chaos. Belridge had likely known his visitor, or believed he did. Trust, she knew, often lowered defenses far more effectively than threat. Later that morning, Miss Marple spoke with the vicar, a gentle man clearly shaken by the events. He described Belridge as devoted but uncompromising, a guardian of moral order who had taken it upon himself to protect the village from what he saw as decline. Recently, he had clashed with several parishioners over matters ranging from charity funds to personal conduct. Each disagreement, Miss Marple noted, was a potential motive waiting to be examined. As villagers gathered in small groups outside the church, Miss Marple listened. Conversations circled the same themes: shock, disbelief, and subtle blame. Some spoke bitterly of Belridge's judgmental nature, others defended him fiercely. One woman remarked that he knew too much for his own good, a statement quickly softened when she realized she had been overheard. Miss Marple made note of that comment. People rarely chose their words carelessly in times of crisis. Even casual remarks often revealed deeply held fears or resentments. She learned that Belridge had summoned someone to the tower the previous evening, though no one claimed to know whom. The bells, she realized, had not rung by accident. They had been triggered during a confrontation, perhaps intentionally, perhaps as a consequence of panic. As afternoon approached, Miss Marple returned to Rosewood Cottage. Clara Hastings recounted a tense village meeting held days earlier, where Belridge had accused several residents of moral failings and threatened to expose unchristian behavior unless changes were made. The meeting had ended poorly, with raised voices and unresolved bitterness. Miss Marple reflected quietly. Exposure was a powerful weapon, especially in a village bound by reputation and tradition. Someone had likely feared Belridge's intentions enough to confront him, and in that confrontation, something had gone terribly wrong. As dusk fell, the church tower loomed once more against the sky, its silence heavy with implication. Miss Marple felt certain that the answer lay not in the bells themselves, but in what Belridge had intended to reveal. And in Brackendale, secrets like bells were never truly silent. As Christmas Eve edged closer to midnight, the atmosphere in Brackendale grew heavier, as though the village itself sensed that something had been set in motion long before the bells rang. Miss Marple spent the evening quietly, listening more than speaking, allowing the villagers' unease to reveal itself in small, telling ways. In her experience, people rarely remained silent when fear pressed upon them. Miss Marple soon learned that Thomas Belridge had not only summoned someone to the church tower, but that he had done so with urgency. Several villagers recalled seeing him earlier that evening, his manner unusually tense. He had spoken of setting matters right before Christmas, a phrase that lingered ominously in Miss Marple's thoughts. Such language suggested an accusation, perhaps even a threat. Clara Hastings shared another detail that evening. Belridge had confided in her that he intended to confront someone before midnight, someone whose actions, he believed, threatened the moral fabric of Brackendale. He had refused to give a name, insisting it was his duty to handle the matter personally. Miss Marple frowned slightly. Moral certainty, she knew, often blinded people to danger. Miss Marple considered the nature of Belridge's authority. Though not ordained, his position as church warden granted him influence and access. He was trusted with keys, funds, and records knowledge that could be used either to protect or to control. Recently, he had begun reviewing church donations and private confessions shared during counseling sessions. Such knowledge could easily become a weapon. As Miss Marple walked through the village that night, she observed lights flickering behind curtained windows. Conversations hushed as she passed. One house, however, stood conspicuously dark, the home of Daniel Frost, the bellringer's assistant and a man who had clashed openly with Belridge in recent weeks. Miss Marple made a mental note. Absence, she knew, could be as revealing as presence. The next morning brought fresh revelations. A young choir member admitted having overheard Belridge arguing with someone near the church entrance shortly before the bells rang. The voices had been raised, the words sharp and hurried. The argument ended abruptly, followed moments later by the sudden peal of bells. Miss Marple felt a familiar tightening of certainty. The ringing had not been planned. It had been provoked. Miss Marple revisited the tower in her mind. The scuffed floor, the strained rope, the broken wreath ornament. These were not the signs of a calculated murder, but of confrontation spiraling out of control. Someone had been accused, perhaps of behavior that would ruin them if exposed. Fear had likely turned to anger, and anger to fatal action. As villagers gathered for an improvised Christmas Eve service, Miss Marple watched their faces as the vicar spoke of forgiveness and peace. Some bowed their heads sincerely. Others looked rigid, their expressions unreadable. One woman left early, unable to endure the tension. Another sat perfectly still, hands clenched in her lap. Miss Marple absorbed it all. She now believed Belridge had confronted someone he believed guilty, threatening exposure before Christmas morning. The bells had rung during that confrontation, either pulled in panic or as a desperate call for attention. In that moment, someone had acted, silencing him forever. As snow continued to fall, Miss Marple returned to Rosewood Cottage, her thoughts aligning with quiet precision. The crime was beginning to take shape, not as an act of long-planned malice, but as the tragic result of rigid judgment and desperate fear. Before midnight arrived again in Brackendale, Miss Marple knew she would uncover who had been accused and who had ensured that the bells would never ring for Thomas Belridge again. By Christmas morning, Brackendale wore a fragile calm. Snow blanketed the village in deceptive purity, masking the unease that had settled into every household. Miss Marple observed how carefully people greeted one another, how smiles appeared rehearsed and conversations ended too quickly. In a village like this, reputation was currency, and someone had been willing to pay for it with blood. Miss Marple spent the morning speaking quietly with those who had crossed paths with Thomas Belridge in recent weeks. Patterns began to emerge. He had taken it upon himself to investigate matters he believed immoral: private relationships, questionable donations, and long-buried indiscretions. He recorded notes obsessively, believing documentation would strengthen his moral authority. Miss Marple suspected those notes were the true motive behind the crime. One name surfaced repeatedly: Lydia Harrell, the organist, a reserved woman who lived alone near the edge of the village. Belridge had openly criticized her for improper associations after she was seen meeting a man late at night. Lydia denied wrongdoing, but her reputation suffered nonetheless. Miss Marple noted the quiet resentment beneath Lydia's composure when Belridge's name was mentioned. Another figure emerged: Peter Hawthorne, a respected shop owner whose generous donations to the church masked troubling inconsistencies in the accounts. Belridge had confronted him privately days before his death. Peter had laughed it off publicly, but Miss Marple sensed unease behind his confident demeanor. Money, she knew, often left trails no one wished to follow. Miss Marple also revisited the Frost household. Daniel Frost had not been present on Christmas Eve, a fact his sister nervously confirmed. Daniel, it seemed, had been dismissed from assisting with the bells after a heated argument with Belridge over access to the tower. Belridge had accused him of negligence and moral laxity, a public humiliation that Daniel had never forgiven. As Miss Marple pieced together these interactions, one truth became clear. Belridge had positioned himself as judge and executioner of reputation. In doing so, he had placed himself in danger. Accusations, when tied to exposure, created desperation, and desperation was fertile ground for violence. That afternoon, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at the vicarage. The atmosphere was polite but strained. When conversation turned to Belridge's death, voices lowered instinctively. Someone remarked that he brought it upon himself, then immediately apologized. Miss Marple smiled gently, understanding that guilt and justification often traveled together. She noticed Lydia Harrow leave abruptly when the discussion touched on the church records. Peter Hawthorne's hand tightened around his teacup when donations were mentioned. Daniel Frost avoided the gathering entirely. Each reaction told a story of fear, not of justice, but of exposure. As evening approached, Miss Marple returned to the church once more. She stood beneath the silent bells, reflecting on how many lives Belridge had unsettled in the name of righteousness. His death, she believed, was not motivated by hatred alone, but by the terror of disgrace. The killer had acted not to gain something, but to prevent losing everything. Miss Marple felt closer now, the shape of the truth sharpening with each observation. The bells had rung not to summon help, but to interrupt an accusation, one that threatened to destroy a carefully maintained facade. And before Christmas night ended, Miss Marple intended to uncover whose reputation had been worth killing for. Late that evening, as the village settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple returned once more to St. Aldwyn's Church. She had learned over the years that the most important clues were often overlooked precisely because they appeared too ordinary. Thomas Belridge had been a methodical man, fond of records and lists. It seemed unlikely to Miss Marple that he would confront someone without leaving behind some form of documentation. The vicar allowed her access to Belridge's small office, a narrow room tucked behind the vestry. It was immaculately arranged, each drawer labeled, each file aligned with almost obsessive care. Miss Marple examined the space slowly, resisting the urge to search hastily. Disorder, she knew, often revealed itself only when calm observation was applied. Inside a ledger marked seasonal accounts, Miss Marple noticed a slip of paper folded carefully between the pages. It appeared insignificant at first glance, a simple note, written in Belridge's precise hand. Yet its placement suggested importance. Belridge had hidden it where only he would think to look. The note contained a single sentence and a name. The wording was vague but unmistakably accusatory. It referred to a secret that would destroy all respect by Christmas morning, if not addressed. Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty settle within her. This note had been Belridge's leverage. The name written was not Lydia Harrow's, nor Peter Hawthorne's, nor Daniel Frost's. It belonged to someone far less obvious, someone whose outward respectability had shielded them from suspicion. Miss Marple closed the ledger gently, her expression unchanged. Though her mind raced ahead, she reflected on Belridge's final movements. He had summoned someone to the tower under the pretense of private reconciliation, armed with the threat of exposure. The note suggested he intended to confront them face to face, perhaps believing moral authority would protect him. It rarely did. Miss Marple left the church quietly, carrying the weight of the discovery with careful discretion. Accusation without proof could destroy lives, and she was determined not to repeat Belridge's mistake. Instead, she observed the villagers anew, this time with clearer understanding. At a small Christmas gathering later that night, Miss Marple watched as the person named in the note interacted effortlessly with others, warm, gracious, and seemingly untouched by the tragedy. Only once did their composure falter, when the church bells were mentioned. It was a fleeting moment, But to Miss Marple, it was confirmation. She now understood why the bells had rung early. The confrontation had escalated quickly. Belridge had threatened exposure. Panic had followed. The bells had been pulled, perhaps as an interruption, perhaps in desperation, and in that moment, the fatal act occurred. Miss Marple retired for the night, certain now that the truth lay within reach. The note, hidden in plain sight, had illuminated the path forward. What remained was to confirm motive, opportunity, and intent without causing further harm. As snow continued to fall outside Rosewood Cottage, Miss Marple folded her knitting and prepared for the final act of the investigation. The village slept, unaware that its most carefully guarded secret was about to be revealed, and before another bell rang in Brackendale, Miss Marple would ensure that justice, not reputation, had the final word. By the following morning, the snow had eased, but the tension in Brackendale had not. Miss Marple sensed a subtle shift among the villagers, an unspoken awareness that the truth was drawing closer. People became more cautious with their words, their politeness edged with anxiety. It was often at this stage, Miss Marple knew, that the guilty revealed themselves not through action, but through restraint. Miss Marple's attention now rested firmly on Reverend Andrew Cole, the village's long-respected former curate, recently returned to Brackendale to spend Christmas among old acquaintances. His reputation was impeccable, kind, charitable, and deeply trusted. He had comforted grieving families, guided lost souls, and mediated disputes for years. No one questioned his integrity. That, Miss Marple reflected, was precisely why Belridge's note had been so dangerous. Belridge had discovered irregularities, connected to a discreet church charity managed years earlier by Reverend Cole. Funds meant for vulnerable families had been quietly redirected, not for greed, but to conceal a deeply personal failing. The truth, if revealed, would not merely damage Cole's reputation. It would destroy the faith the village had placed in him. For a man whose identity was built upon moral authority, exposure would be unbearable. Miss Marple arranged a quiet conversation with the Reverend that afternoon. They spoke politely at first, exchanging pleasantries about the weather and Christmas traditions. But when Miss Marple gently mentioned Belridge's concern for honesty and transparency, she noticed the Reverend's hands tremble almost imperceptibly. She spoke not with accusation, but with understanding. Miss Marple suggested that Belridge's methods had been harsh, his certainty misplaced. The Reverend listened closely, his composure strained. When she mentioned the church tower, the bells, and the note Belridge had left behind, something within him fractured. He admitted meeting Belridge that night. Belridge had confronted him with the evidence, demanding confession and public acknowledgement before Christmas morning. The bells, the Reverend confessed, had rung during their argument, not by design, but by chaos. In the struggle that followed, Belridge had fallen. Panic, not malice, had guided the Reverend's actions in those final moments. Miss Marple listened quietly, her expression gentle but resolute. She did not excuse the act, but she understood it. Fear of disgrace had overwhelmed reason. In attempting to preserve his moral standing, the Reverend had committed the very sin Belridge sought to expose. As the Reverend finished speaking, relief mingled with despair. The truth, once spoken, lost its power to terrorize. Miss Marple advised him to tell the authorities everything. Silence, she reminded him, had already cost one life. That evening, as Christmas lights glowed faintly across Brackendale, Miss Marple prepared for the final resolution. The truth was no longer hidden. What remained was the village's reckoning with justice, forgiveness, and the cost of appearances. The bells of St. Aldwyn's remained silent that night, but their echo lingered in every conscience. The following day dawned clear and cold, the snow reflecting a pale winter sun that offered little warmth. Brackendale awoke to an uneasy sense of anticipation, as though the village itself knew that the truth could no longer remain buried. Miss Marple felt it in the way doors opened cautiously, in the hushed greetings exchanged on the lane, and in the way eyes followed her with quiet curiosity, Reverend Andrew Cole kept his word. Before noon, he asked the vicar to summon the authorities once more. The storm had passed, and access to the village was restored. When the constable arrived, Cole spoke calmly, though his face bore the weight of sleepless nights. He confessed fully his misuse of charity funds years earlier, Belridge's discovery, and the confrontation in the church tower that ended in tragedy. Miss Marple was present only briefly, offering clarification when asked, never embellishing, never judging. She explained the significance of the note, the early ringing of the bells, and the physical signs in the tower that supported Cole's account. The facts align neatly now, forming a story as tragic as it was inevitable. Word of the confession spread quickly through Brackendale. Shock rippled through the village, followed by disbelief. Some refused to accept it at first, clinging to the image of the Reverend they had trusted for so long. Others reacted with quiet understanding, recognizing the familiar human weakness beneath the fall from grace. Miss Marple observed both responses with calm empathy. She had seen them many times before. That evening, the church doors opened once more, not for celebration, but for reflection. Villagers gathered in silence, candles glowing softly against the stone walls. The bells did not ring. Instead, the vicar spoke of truth, humility, and the danger of placing any person beyond question. His words carried a resonance deeper than any peal of bronze. Miss Marple sat near the back, knitting resting untouched in her lap. She reflected on Belridge himself, man so certain of righteousness that he failed to recognize the danger of confrontation without compassion. Justice, she knew, required more than exposure. It required understanding. As the service ended, villagers filed out quietly. Some paused to thank Miss Marple, others merely nodded in respect. She accepted both with equal grace. The work was nearly done. Later that night, Miss Marple stood outside Rosewood Cottage, listening as the bells of St. Aldwyn's finally rang softly, solemnly, and at the proper hour. This time, they rang not in alarm, but in acknowledgement of truth. Only one chapter remained. Christmas morning arrived in Brackendale with a stillness that felt earned rather than imposed. The snow lay undisturbed along the lanes, and thin trails of smoke rose gently from cottage chimneys. For the first time since the bells had rung too early, the village seemed able to breathe again. The truth, once revealed, had settled into the stones and streets. Heavy but honest. Reverend Andrew Cole was taken quietly from the village later that morning. There was no spectacle, no angry crowd, only solemn faces watching as a man once revered departed under the weight of his own actions. Some villagers wept openly, others stood in silence. Miss Marple observed them all, knowing that grief often took the form of mourning not just for people, but for illusions lost. Inside St. Aldwyn's Church, the decorations remained holly candles and evergreen wreaths, symbols of hope that felt fragile yet sincere. The vicar moved through the space slowly, as though relearning it. The bells above remained still, their power no longer feared but deeply respected. They had spoken once in warning, and now their silence felt appropriate. Miss Marple paid one final visit to the church tower. The scuff marks had been cleaned, the broken ornament replaced. Yet the memory of what had happened there lingered. She reflected on Thomas Belridge, a man driven by certainty, undone by his inability to temper judgment with mercy. His death, she knew, was a tragedy shaped as much by righteousness as by fear. Back at Rosewood Cottage, Miss Marple packed her belongings carefully. Clara Hastings watched her with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. The village would never be quite the same again. Miss Marple reassured her gently that change, though painful, often allowed truth to take root where silence once reigned. As Miss Marple prepared to leave Brackendale, villagers gathered to bid her farewell. There were quiet words of thanks, tentative smiles, and respectful nods. No one spoke of the crime directly. It no longer needed to be named. Its lesson had already settled deeply into the collective conscience. The train pulled away slowly, carrying Miss Marple through snow-covered fields bathed in pale winter light. She resumed her knitting, her expression calm and reflective. Another mystery had reached its end not with triumph, but with understanding. She considered how often Christmas revealed what people worked hardest to conceal. The season of goodwill demanded honesty, and when denied, it exacted a terrible price. Yet it also offered forgiveness for those brave enough to face the truth. As the bells of Brackendale rang one final time in the distant soft, measured and rightfully timed, Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. Justice had been served, not loudly, but faithfully, and in the quiet after the bells, peace at last had room to enter.